Have you ever thought about the magic happening inside us right now? Like we're constantly rebuilding ourselves. And one of the most impressive things our bodies do is how our bones develop. That process is called ossification. Are you ready for a deep dive into how bones form? We've got some amazing research on this, and it's a lot more complex and a lot cooler than you might think.
Oh, it really is.
Yeah.
And, most people don't even realize that there are actually two main ways that bones can form intramembranous and endochondral ossification. But here's the big surprise. Even though cartilage is really important in bone formation, it's not actually transformed into bone. It gets completely replaced.
Wait, replace so it's like a temporary scaffold that gets swapped out for the real thing. I'm really interested now. Tell me more about this cartilage and why it's so important to begin with.
Well, think of cartilage as the blueprint for our skeletons. It's the framework that guides bone formation, especially in a developing fetus. That flexible material is made by special cells called chondroblasts, and those become chondrocytes once they are fully encased.
Okay, so the chondroblasts are kind of like the architects, and the chondrocytes are the construction workers. They're building up that cartilage framework. But if cartilage is so important, why would the body go through the trouble of replacing it with a bone?
That's a great question. You see, cartilage is great for early development because it's flexible and it can grow quickly, but it does have limitations. For one thing, it's avascular.
Avascular, what does that mean?
It means it doesn't have any blood vessels. So any nutrients and waste have to travel by diffusion, which is a really slow process.
Oh, so that's why cartilage injuries, like when I tore my meniscus playing soccer, take so long to heal. It's like trying to deliver supplies to a remote island on a tiny boat.
Exactly. Now, bone, on the other hand, has a ton of blood vessels, which makes it stronger and way better at repairing itself.
That makes a lot of sense.
Now back to those two ossification processes. Intramembranous ossification is how those flat bones are formed, like the ones in your skull and your clavicles. It all starts with mesenchymal cells, stem cells with the potential to become all sorts of different cell types. They come together like artists ready to create a masterpiece.
So we've got our mesenchymal cells all in position. What happens next? Do they just magically transform into bone?
Well, not quite. Some of them specialize to become capillaries, which create those vital blood vessels, while others become osteoblasts, the master bone builders. And these osteoblasts cluster together and form what's called an ossification center.
So it's like a city popping up in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. From these centers, the osteoblasts secrete a substance called osteoid.
Osteoid, what is that?
It's like the soft, uncalcified version of bone matrix. And within a few days, mineral salts are deposited on the osteoid, which hardens it and traps the osteoblasts inside.
Trap. So what happens to those osteoblasts once they're stuck in this hardened matrix?
It's like they get a promotion. They become osteocytes, the mature bone cells responsible for maintaining the bone tissue. But don't worry, new osteoblasts are constantly being recruited from the surrounding connective tissue to keep the building process going.
Wow, so it's this never-ending cycle of construction and maintenance. It's amazing how all these different cells work together to create something so strong and so intricate. But I have to ask, how does all this become a solid bone? I mean, you've got this web of cells and osteoid, but how does that actually form a bone?
Okay, picture this. The osteoid is laid down around those capillaries we talked about, forming a network of tiny beams called trabeculae.
Yeah.
This creates this spongy, porous bone structure.
Uh-huh.
And then the osteoblasts on the surface become what's called the periosteum, the tough outer membrane that covers and protects the bone.
Ah, so the periosteum is responsible for forming the hard outer layer of compact bone that we can feel.
That's right. Remember all those blood vessels woven into that spongy bone? Well, those condense and they become red marrow. The stuff that produces our blood cells. It's like a hidden factory right inside our bones.
Wow, that's amazing. Even bone marrow formation is part of this process.
It is. And here's another cool fact. A baby's skull isn't completely fused together at birth.
Really?
Yeah, the spaces between the bones are called sutures, and those allow the skull to change shape during birth and then continue to grow during childhood.
Can you imagine if a baby had to be born with a completely formed skull?
Nope, not a chance. So that flexibility is crucial for a safe delivery. So that intramembranous ossification, that's also how we get all of our unique facial features too.
Okay, so that's intramembranous ossification. What about this endochondral process? You said earlier that it involves replacing cartilage entirely. How does that work?
Endochondral ossification, that one's a much longer process, where cartilage acts as a sort of temporary model, a scaffold that gets completely replaced by bone. It's kind of like when a sculptor creates a detailed model in clay before they cast it in bronze. The clay model is like the cartilage, and the bronze is the final bone.
I like that analogy. So the cartilage is basically just a placeholder for the bone. But why go through all that trouble? Wouldn't it be easier to just, transform the cartilage directly into bone?
Well, I guess nature has its reasons. Remember how we were talking about how cartilage is so flexible and it can grow quickly? Well, that makes it perfect for those early stages of skeletal development.
Hmm.
When the embryo is rapidly changing and growing, but then as the skeleton matures, it needs a stronger, more durable material
Mhm.
to support all that weight and movement. And that's where bone comes in.
So it's like upgrading from a lightweight frame to something much more sturdy. Okay, so walk me through this endochondral ossification. How does it actually work?
So it all starts around 6 to 8 weeks after conception. Those mesenchymal cells we talked about earlier, the ones that can turn into so many different cell types, well, they transform into chondrocytes, and they form a cartilaginous skeleton.
Mm.
And then a membrane called the perichondrium forms around this cartilage model.
Okay, so we've got our cartilage model all set up. It's encased in this perichondrium. What happens next?
As the cartilage grows, the chondrocytes in the center start to die off,
Mm.
and the matrix that surrounds them starts to calcify. It hardens,
Mhm.
and it blocks nutrients from reaching those cells. So you start to get cavities inside the cartilage.
So the cartilage is basically causing its own destruction. It's amazing how that sets the stage for bone formation. So what happens when those cavities form?
Well, those cavities are invaded by blood vessels, and those blood vessels bring along our bone-building heroes, the
The
osteoblasts, right?
osteoblasts.
And they start laying down new bone, and eventually those cavities merge to become what's called the medullary cavity. That's that hollow space in the center of long bones.
So those blood vessels are like pioneers. They're forging new paths and bringing in the construction crews to build the bone from the inside out.
That's a great way to put it. And while all of this is happening, that perichondrium we talked about earlier transforms into the periosteum, and osteoblasts start forming a collar of compact bone around what's called the diaphysis, which is the shaft of the long bone. So you actually have bone forming on the outside and the inside of the cartilage model at the same time.
Wow, that's complicated. A lot is happening all at once.
It is. It's very intricate. Around the second or third month of fetal development, a primary ossification center forms, deep inside that bony collar. And that really kicks bone development into high gear. But here's the really cool part. While the bone is replacing cartilage in the diaphysis, the cartilage at the ends of the bone, the epiphyses, that cartilage keeps growing, pushing the bone ends further apart.
Wait, so you're saying that in one part of the bone, bone is replacing cartilage, but in another part, cartilage is still growing, making the bone longer overall. That's pretty incredible. It's like this perfectly coordinated dance between growth and replacement.
It is a remarkable process. And after birth, this same process of cartilage dying blood vessels invading osteoblasts building bone, well, that all happens in the epiphyseal regions, the ends of the bones.
Yeah.
And these areas of activity are called secondary ossification centers.
So we have these centers of bone formation at both ends of the bone while the bone is also growing longer. It's like a three-ring circus of bone development.
You could say that. But now let's zoom in on how bones actually grow in length. That's a pretty fascinating process on its own, and it all comes down to a special area called the epiphyseal plate. It's a layer of cartilage where all the action happens in growing bones. Think of it like the engine of bone lengthening, constantly pushing the ends of the bone further apart.
So you've got this cartilage plate between the bone ends. How does that actually make the bone longer? What's happening in that epiphyseal plate?
Imagine two processes happening at the same time. On one side, you have cartilage cells dividing and multiplying, pushing the epiphysis away from the diaphysis. And on the other side, cartilage is being replaced by bone, making the diaphysis longer. This simultaneous growth and replacement, that's what drives bone lengthening.
So it's like this constant tug of war with cartilage growth on one side and bone formation on the other. And the result is a longer bone. It's amazing how our bodies orchestrate all of that so perfectly.
It is. And this epiphyseal plate isn't just a random collection of cells. It's actually highly organized. It has 4 distinct zones, each with its own specialized cells and function.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Tell me about these 4 zones. How do they all work together?
Okay, so think of it like a factory production line. The zone closest to the end of the bone is called the reserve zone. It's full of inactive cartilage cells, and it kind of anchors the plate to the bone.
Okay, so that's our foundation, our starting point. What happens next as we move along this production line?
Next comes the zone of proliferation. That's where things really start happening. The cartilage cells in this zone are dividing and multiplying, pushing the older cells toward the middle of the bone.
So it's like a cellular conveyor belt churning out new cells to make the bone longer? What happens to those older cells as they get pushed along?
Well, they enter the zone of hypertrophy. That's where they start to enlarge. They get bigger.
Like a spa day for cells. But I bet this is all in preparation for their final curtain call.
You got it. Their next stop is the zone of calcification. In this zone, the matrix surrounding those enlarged cells begins to harden, like cement setting around bricks. And this calcification cuts off their nutrient supply, which leads to their demise.
So it's like a cycle of growth maturation and then sacrifice all to make way for new bone. And those spaces left behind by the dying cartilage cells, that's where the blood vessels and the osteoblasts come in?
Right. Exactly. It's a remarkable system. It's all perfectly coordinated,
Hmm.
you know? It allows those bones to grow to their full length. But here's something I've always wondered about. We've talked about how bones grow, but what tells the body to stop growing?
That is a great question. We don't keep growing forever, so something must tell those growth plates to shut down. What do we know about that?
Well, it's definitely not just a simple on-off switch. It seems like it's a really complex mix of factors. But hormones play a big role. Those teenage growth spurts. Those are actually triggered by a surge in sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone.
Uh,
And those same hormones actually signal the beginning of the end for bone lengthening.
So it's like a hormonal symphony conducting this dance of bone growth and it eventually brings it to an end. But if hormones are the conductors, are there other instruments in this orchestra? Do genetics and nutrition play a role?
Oh, absolutely. Genetics definitely determines our potential for height, and nutrition provides the building blocks for healthy bone growth. It's amazing how all these factors work together to create our skeletons.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground today. From the very beginning stages of bone development, where cartilage is just a temporary scaffold, to the complex way that growth and replacement happens at the epiphyseal plate.
And we even touched on the fact that scientists are looking into ways to actually manipulate bone growth, potentially using gene therapy or growth factors to treat conditions like dwarfism or limb length discrepancies. It's a really exciting field with so much potential.
So not only are we constantly rebuilding ourselves, but maybe one day we'll be able to influence that process in ways we never imagined. That's a pretty incredible thought.
It is, and it just goes to show how important it is to understand how bone development works.
So I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. We started with that initial blueprint of cartilage, then we went all the way to the mysteries of how growth plates close. It's clear that bone formation is a truly remarkable process.
It really is. The more we learn about it, the more we appreciate how intricate and how efficient the human body is.
Well, if you're as fascinated by this topic as we are, I definitely encourage you to do your own deep dive into the factors that control growth plate closure. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the one to unlock some new secrets about bone growth.
It's a field that's just waiting for new discoveries.
Yeah,
So who knows what the future holds? Maybe one day we'll be able to guide and enhance bone development in even more precise ways.
that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of bone formation.